All right, welcome everybody to this month's edition of the Beyond Compliance webinar and podcast series. I'm Brian Sharp with Safety Chain Software, and I want to thank all of you for joining us and making time out of your very busy schedules here as we get the year started off for a really important and timely topic. This month we're going to be talking about the new Safe Food for Canadians regulation, and make sure that you're ready. And we are very fortunate to have an expert on the topic, Cameron Prince, who's the VP of Regulatory Affairs over at the Acheson Group, join us, and a little more on him in just a few moments. But given the buzz around this that we received, even the advanced questions, we're really excited. So this is exactly what we try and do with this series, make sure we're getting you topics that are timely and helpful. And so we're going to dig right in because we got a whole bunch of content to get to. So for those of you that are new, we want to welcome you. This is a series we put on each and every month at no charge to our community. The idea is to bring in thought leaders and consultants and industry experts like Cameron and his team at TAG to talk about what's going on in the industry, what are some of the best practices, trends, technologies being used. And the idea is that you can take something away that you can use in your business today. And sometimes it's strategy, sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's trends and other updates. So we welcome you, want to let you know we do these for you. So we want to hear from you. What do you like? What would you like to hear more about? Even specific presenters are all welcome. So thanks for being here, and we hope you'll continue to join us. You keep coming, we'll keep putting them on. As I mentioned, we're very pleased, we're proud to put this on for our community of food safety and quality professionals. We wanted to put together a series that was really educational in nature, and that's really what we've strived to do here. So you're going to hear a lot of really great strategy and tactical stuff from our presenters over the course of the series. We're on the technology side, so at Safety Chain, we help food and beverage companies improve productivity, profitability, and compliance. And we do that with the industry's leading cloud-based food quality management system. So if you are looking to improve anything from just getting rid of paper to driving continuous improvement, we have a suite of solutions around food safety, quality, and compliance that we would love to show you more of, and are here as a resource for anything that we can do on the technology side. So definitely check us out at safetychain.com, and hopefully we can connect with some of you to help out. Few housekeeping items to get into, just a few tips. One is that we try and keep these pretty informal. So while there's a lot of really great content and some awesome presenters, we'd like to make these conversational. Cameron, because of the nature of the topic, has a lot of content today. So we're going to save questions for the end. We don't know exactly how much time we'll have left. The goal is to get you all the content we can on this important topic. Cameron has agreed to take any questions we don't get to. He'll take those offline directly. We'll also be sending out a copy of the replay, which is one of the most common questions we get, with a link to the deck. So they've been very gracious in sharing all this great content, and we'll make sure you get that, and also access to Cameron, his team, and get answers to your questions. So we'll do our best to get to what we can, but don't be disappointed if we don't cover all of them here, but we are very, very excited. You'll also notice that only the panelists are displayed, so when you send a question, they come just to us, and but the rest of the folks are in the room. I guess we're getting close to, what do we have, about over 400, I think, registered for this. So we got a big audience today, which is awesome, but when you send your questions over, they're coming to just us, so don't be shy. And I mentioned there will be a recording link shared, probably get that out hopefully by the end of the week or so. If you have any audio issues, we do have Ann from our team standing by in the back end. So if you have a question, usually the go-to move with these solutions with GoToWebinar is to log out, log back in, or you have two audio sources, phone or web, and you can alternate from one to the other. Typically, the web source is usually the most dependable. So we'll do our best to help you out if we can. That said, if you have a question, fire those off. Seen a couple already in the box there. You can use the question box on the right-hand panel. There's also a chat panel as well, but the question box will be the place to push everything over to. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring in the man of the hour, the person you really came to hear. Little bit about Cameron. I think all of you are familiar with the Acheson Group, who's a wonderful partner of ours here at Safety Chain. Cameron Prince is their Vice President of Regulatory Affairs over at the Acheson Group, affectionately known as TAG in the industry. He has over 30 years of industry experience in food regulatory programs in both the US and Canada, including a senior executive role at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which I think will come in quite handy as he shares some intimate knowledge about what's going on with this new regulation here. So we've got a lot to cover. I got a sneak peek at what he's doing today, and I think you're going to love it. So with that, I'm going to turn it right over to you, Cameron. Get out of the way and let you go.
Well, thanks very much, Brian, and greetings to everyone who's listening today. Looking forward to have an opportunity to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, having been involved in the actual creation of these regulations going back a number of years. It's certainly gratifying to see them finally in place. But of course, with any new set of regulations, especially a set of changes as massive as this, there are lots of questions and bound to be a few bumps along the road. So I will, this is very much a highlight presentation. These regulations, like the FISMA human food rule, are very detailed, very lengthy. So I'm really doing a high-level summary of the important stuff that's in this, and hopefully that's helpful, and hopefully we'll get some time to answer some questions. So I'll jump right into it. Make sure I get this slide advancing. Heck, there we go. Good. Whoops, I went too far. Okay, so we're going to talk about today about the Safe Food for Canadians Act, which is parallel to the FISMA Act that was passed back in 2011. The Act is the Safe Food for Canadians Act, and then the recently January 15th implemented regulations or final rules under the Safe Food for Canadians Act. So it took 6 years to get these from Act to regulation. So it's there's been a lot of work that's gone into this with industry and government. So we're going to overview key elements and the impacts on the current food safety and environment, what it means for you. Many of you are, I believe, are US based. And if you're doing any business with Canada, I'm sure there are impacts. I'm sure that's why you're on the line. So I will try to not entirely look at it from that perspective, but mostly from what does it mean for US exporters, importers, manufacturers. We're going to then talk about the 3 pillars of the new Safe Food for Canadians regulations, and that is licensing, preventive control measures, and traceability. So most of the time we spend on those 3 pillars, and then we'll talk about how this is going to work, steps to transition, and then we'll move to questions. Okay. So, as I said, the Safe Food for Canadians Act was passed by Parliament way back in 2012, and it really didn't it did not come into effect until these regulations came into effect on the 15th of January. So it had no teeth, but it certainly was there, something to build on, and very parallel to the situation in the U.S. with FISMA. Of course, what drove this goes back to several major food safety incidents that occurred in Canada and internationally. One in particular was the Listeria incident where 23 people died, Maple Leaf Foods back in the late 2000s, XL Foods. There was a number of incidents that drove the government to say the current food regulatory system in Canada was out of date and needed to be looked at and updated. So there were official parliamentary committees. Weatherall was one. They made recommendations, and the government acted. So then, flash forward to June 2018, the government finally published the Safe Food for Canadians regulations and decided that they would not make the effective date till January 15th, 2019. So that's where we are now. The day is come and passed, and it's so far it's going well. A few glitches I've heard about, but generally it's going well. Of course, there is phase in on this, so not everything's happened as of January 15th. Various commodities, there are phase in periods, very much like FISMA. So now, rather than a whole bunch of different pieces of legislation, meat inspection, fish inspection, Canadian Agricultural Products Act, parts of Food and Drug Act, all that stuff disappears, and the Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations become the primary and single food law in Canada. Food and Drugs Act still is there, and parts of it apply, but the primary thing is Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations. Okay, so as of January 15th, there is no longer, I'm going too fast on these. The Meat Inspection Act, excuse me, I need to be patient. So the Meat Inspection Act, the Fish Inspection Act, and the Canadian Agricultural Products Act that you see here are now gone. So it's just the Safe Food for Canadians Act. Those acts are very out of date, were created before the internet and many other advances in legal rulings and so on. So they no longer made a lot of sense and weren't that applicable any longer. There is a broad-based piece of legislation called Consumer Packaging and Labeling Act, and the food parts of that still apply. There are a few parts of the Foods and Drugs Act that covers drugs and medical devices and some food. Parts of those are still in place. And we still have the Canadian Food Inspection Agency Act, which is really a high-level act that governs the functioning of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Okay, so here are the highlights of the Safe Food for Canadians Act. I'm sorry, Brian, I'm having a little trouble with the back and forth. Okay. So there are provisions against food tampering and deceptive practices. There's stronger food traceability, more import controls, simplification, a different inspection, updated inspection and enforcement powers for inspectors. Before this act came into place, only certain foods could be certified for export. Now all foods can be certified for export, which is a great advantage for industry. There are new review mechanisms and appeal mechanisms. And along with that, there are definitely stronger fines and penalties associated with violations of the act. So some of the older acts had several $100 fines was the maximum. Now they're up to up to $3 or $4 million. One important fact to understand here is that this is a federal Canadian act. So it applies to any food that's imported to Canada, exported from Canada, that is shipped from province to province in Canada. So it's really 90% of the food falls under this act. However, it does not apply to food that is manufactured within a province and sold only within that province. So that gap is not yet fully addressed. Provinces have their own systems, perhaps not as well developed in some cases as the federal system, but it is somewhat parallel to the situation in the U.S. So that's one area where it doesn't apply, is intra-provincial. Okay, who does what? For those of you in the U.S., you may not be that familiar with the who does what in federal food inspection in Canada, and this is kind of important to know. Of course, many of you will have dealt with these agencies, so will be familiar also. Health Canada is looks after all health issues in Canada, including medical delivery programs, hospitals, etc. So food is just a small part of what Health Canada does. They do set the standards, the high-level standards. So for food in Canada. So they approve food additives, for example, or they set maximum residue levels, those kinds of things. And they administer the Food and Drugs Act, which includes drugs and medical devices and food. CFIA is the main operational delivery agency and is the organization that you will be interacting with almost entirely when it comes to these new regulations. So CFIA does food inspections, they do recalls, they manage those, enforcement, export certification, licensing, penalties. The organization reports to both the Ministers of Health and Agriculture, and it is the main body that you're dealing with. For public health, the Public Health Agency is very parallel to the CDC in the U.S., and if there is a foodborne illness outbreak in Canada, they are the ones that goes across provincial boundaries. They are the ones that investigate. Okay, so just the highlights of these regulations. This is a very significant regulatory initiative. In fact, I was told by a former colleague of mine at CFIA that this, in 2018, was the largest regulatory change package in the whole government of Canada. So that's pretty significant. It consolidates an old set of 14 different types of regulations into one and treats all food the same. Well, with a few exceptions for commodity requirements, but generally these regulations apply equally across all foods. Some of the older pieces of the regulations that have been carried over. Not all, but many commodity-specific requirements remain. So there are programs and there are things in meat inspection. There are things in seafood inspection that are, for example, that are peculiar to those commodities. Those are carried over into these new regulations. But for the most part, we're looking at a harmonizing across all food. It is complex. It's very thorough, the whole package. And there are new elements. And those are the three pillars that I talked about. Preventive controls, which I'll dive into a bit more. Not a new concept, but it goes beyond HACCP, it goes beyond food safety. Licensing of all parties involved in the production of food that will fall under this, and I'll talk about the details of licensing, and then mandatory traceability requirements. There is also a thing called incorporation by reference. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it is a very good thing in that these regulations can reference guidance documents issued by CFIA. So that means they have the power of a regulation, but they can be changed easily. And I mean, that's a double-edged sword, but for the most part, that plays in favor of industry because it allows for fairly quick changes. To actually change a regulation can take up to 2 years. So this allows for sensible, logical policy changes to be incorporated into the regulations more easily. Okay, this just quickly is a slide showing the structure of the regulations. You don't need to really know this, but you'll see that there are 17 sections, and the key ones that I'm going to focus on today are parts 3, 4, and 5 that will impact you directly, and that is licensing, preventive controls, and traceability. So it seems like the title of this slide is missing, but really this is just about the benefits of these new regulations. Why did the Government of Canada do all of this? Well, ultimately it's for safer food. And I firmly believe, and as do others, that the streamlining, the recall, the traceability, the mandatory preventive controls, all of these things are going to lead to safer food. Food recall is really enhanced in these regulations, and certainly I believe that food recalls will be done more effectively and quicker and protect more people in future. More modern food inspection programs, and much better controls for imported foods. That was considered a major, I don't know about a gap, but there was not as much coverage on imported foods as policymakers and politicians would like, and us in the food safety world. So now with licensing and mandatory preventive controls for importers, we're definitely looking at much safer and better control of imported foods. So benefits for industry, it lays out a level playing field, much more than in the past. And by that I mean that inspection programs will be applied more equally across commodities. We're moving from the days where a meat processing plant had a resident inspector every day, and meanwhile the bakery about a block away would see the inspector once every 5 years, if that often. Now, the risk profiles are obviously different, and we're not throwing out risk in this whole equation, but certainly it's fair competition from inspection coverage standpoint, but also it means that industry can be a lot more innovative, and rules will apply equally across different foods, and that makes for better competition. Better traceabilities and recalls, as I said, better opportunity to innovate technologies in food, greater accessibility to export certificates, all done electronically now. I'll talk about that. Better prevention of foodborne illness outbreaks, and as I said, there'll be more flexible policy changes that will happen quicker by CFIA. And one of the definite new concepts that's been brought in is outcome-based versus being very prescriptive. You'll find as you go through these regulations that they do not say, thou shalt do this, or that the wall shall be 9.5 feet high. There's nothing like that in there. It allows for more flexibility and being outcome-based so that the real needs of the regulations or what they're intended to do, these things are met. Now that of course, some parts of industry would like to see lots of prescriptiveness because it makes it easier. The standard is this, and that's what we're doing, and we're okay. But I think most people looking at this would prefer to have that flexibility. And again, there's improved opportunities here, particularly for exporters. So here's some other industry impacts. So all food businesses, essentially, except for those interprovincial, are all going to have preventive control programs. So there was mandatory HACCP in some programs, but now we're looking at everybody's got to have this. And certainly there weren't very many importers, just a handful who had anything like a preventive control program. Now they all will have to have preventive control programs for their imported goods, as will all processors and some brokers, distributors. There will be more CFI inspection for companies that were considered low priority before. Just a quick point on the next bullet that if you're in the fruit and vegetable business, this will mean something to you. You'll be exempt from the fruit and veg license previously required if you're a member of the Dispute Resolution Corporation. If you're in that business, you'll know what that means. I won't go into the details for the sake of time. There will be greater CFIA enforcement. There's no doubt about that. There will be use in food of what they call administrative monetary penalties. This is essentially being able to levy a fine without going to court. Very much, it's not exactly the same as a traffic ticket, but it's the same concept that the inspector issues a document that says you violated, here's the penalty, pay it. Now there are appeal mechanisms, so that you will see used much more. There will be costs because the licenses cost $250 and certificates cost a certain amount. So there are additional costs for industry, not huge, but there are more. And certainly there will be impacts for those companies who have not been in the game, so to speak, in terms of preventive controls, HACCP, et cetera. If a company is new to this, and doesn't have HACCP, doesn't have any food safety controls, then definitely there will have to be an investment to build those things. And that's the very same situation that happened with FISMA in the U.S. So licensing, all companies So all companies who will require a license, and the CFIA did have licenses and registrations before. So for example, there were fish and seafood import licenses, there were meat establishment registrations, dairy establishment registrations. All of those things are now replaced with a CFIA, the single CFIA, Safe Food for Canadians license. So companies have to apply for that license. They have to identify all the products they're dealing with, either importing or manufacturing, and they must demonstrate that they have a preventive control program. When that application is made and that attestation is given that there is a written preventive control program in place, I can tell you that 95% of the time you will not have a pre-licensing inspection. You will receive your license over electronically. In some rare cases, CFIA may have questions. There may be a poor track record, or there may be a very high-risk new product, and they may choose to do an inspection before a license is issued, but that is not going to happen very often. Just so everyone knows, it may be obvious, but licenses can definitely be suspended or canceled. That's not a whole lot different from the current situation where if you have some problems, have problems, the corrective action will be issued by an inspector, and if you don't correct that within a certain time frame, the license will get suspended. Cancellation doesn't happen very often, but it can happen if a company is particularly non-compliant. At least on my screen, the titles aren't showing here, but this slide is about preventive controls and what they actually mean. So preventive controls, as I said, are a condition of licensing. This is not new stuff for most of you. This is simply HACCP plus some other things is the simplest way to put it. So it's based on Codex HACCP, but it requires a company to show that they're meeting all regulatory requirements. So HACCP being strictly a food safety program, what these regulations are saying now is you must have, beyond basic HACCP, you have to have things like weight controls, label controls, etc. Those things you have. So for anybody that's got a HACCP program or has GFSI certification, you've already got what's required. You do have to do a gap analysis though, and make sure that there are some somewhat obscure regulatory requirements, like maybe your product is subject to grading, so you'll need to show you have controls that you're meeting the grades as you declare them, as an example. Much like FISMA, stronger emphasis on supplier assurance programs is there in these regulations as well. Importers have to conduct detailed risk evaluations, so they have to look at all their suppliers, and there are templates available on the CFIA website to show you how to do this, but definitely importers will need to make decisions about how they build their supplier assurance programs. Obviously, company manufacturers will have to maintain detailed and documented policies, procedures, and records. That goes without saying. These companies that are licensed will be audited by CFIA, and that means they've tentatively made a commitment to audit everyone within 3 years of their coming into force, the regulation for that company. So we'll see if that's going to happen, but because that could be a heck of a lot of regulated parties. We'll see. Just to emphasize that the CFI values GFSI certification, and this will be a major factor in their determining risk and whether or not a company is higher priority. So strongly advocate that where possible and it's within your means to have GFSI certification, or have suppliers have your GFSI certification as well. This will not, this is not the only factor CFI will look at. There are other factors and other issues, but GFSI certification will definitely be an important factor in CFI decision making. Obviously, GFSI is a business choice. Have to remember that these regulations are the actual law, so there's a difference there. Okay, so this is about traceability. There are much stronger traceability requirements in place with these acts or with these regulations. There really was nothing very clear in the previous acts about traceability. Now there's verbiage in there that makes it very clear. You have to be able to trace completely 100%, one step forward and one step back, and with not a lot of leniency in terms of percentages on that. It needs to be as close to 100% as practical. So for processors, that means all packaging and ingredients have to be traceable back to the original vendor. I should mention that food additives are exempt and are not covered in these regulations. So food additives, that doesn't apply traceability to food additives for processors. Curiously, it seems like a bit of a gap there, but that's the way it worked out. And all finished products have to be traceable to the first level of distribution. For importers, they have to trace back to the foreign vendor and processor and have records and knowledge about those foreign suppliers, and have to trace back to the first level of distribution. Now, I know this is pretty basic stuff, but and most companies have this well in hand. I don't see widespread problems with that in the industry in North America. However, it was never a regulatory requirement in many places, so it's now there. In fact, it's stronger in this regulation than it is in FISMA. Well, FISMA doesn't deal with traceability quite as much as these regulations do. Just for those of you who are kind of familiar with former CFIA programs, there was FSEP, which was the non-fish HACCP program, the QMP, which was the fish HACCP program, and other HACCP programs existed in CFIA. Those are gone now. The Safe Food for Canadians Preventive Control programs replace all of those. And that's because they're not comprehensive enough, and they were overly prescriptive, and they don't address a lot of new requirements. So who needs a license? Just in a bit more detail. Anyone who imports food, manufactures, processes, treats, preserves. I don't want to read the slide, but you can see that essentially anybody manufacturing, processing needs a license. If you're in the business of exporting food, and now that could be a manufacturer that exports, it can also be a broker or a buyer who buys lots of food from a bunch of companies and then exports. They will also need a license, even though they don't have any kind of processing plant, may not actually house or touch the food at any point, but the fact that they're exporting requires them to have a license. Anybody that slaughters food animals for export obviously have to have a license, and that's an important point about these regulations. Unlike in the U.S., where you have USDA for meat and catfish, etc., and FDA for other foods, these regulations cover all foods, including meat. So everything falls under this, including slaughter of food animals. So you will see humane treatment, humane slaughter provisions in here that you don't see in FISMA. Anybody that stores or handles a meat product that is imported to Canada, so This is a kind of a holdover from the old meat program where meat products have to be inspected on import. There has been, I won't go into details today, there's not enough time, but there has been some loosening up of that requirement for meat, which if anybody in the meat business wants more details, we can provide. There are some exemptions, personal use, food additives, etc., which I mentioned already. Okay, so what is a preventive control? This is a pretty general definition. It's not quite as elaborate as the one for FISMA. It's just measures that prevent or mitigate hazards associated with preparing food products. It's based on codex. I think just to emphasize, when they say mitigate hazards, that means not only food safety hazards, but not complying with regulation. So if your label is wrong, your list of ingredients is incorrect, you don't meet compositional standards, your weights are wrong, these non-food safety things, they are also hazards that have to be covered under preventive control program. So a preventive control, now we're talking about, is very nuanced, but this is what a plan is, and the plan has to be a written document. When I say written, it can be electronic, obviously. So there needs to be something physical that an inspector can look at. It can't be just a collection of papers and say, yeah, I've got this bill of lading, I've got this COA. It has to be a well-organized preventive control plan that's in place and is being implemented, and records are being kept, etc. So more on preventive controls. As I said, it's industry-wide. This is going to be new for companies that haven't previously been regulated by CFIA and are not familiar with food safety programs. There is a very good tool. There's a bunch of good tools, I should say, at this point on the CFIA website. I strongly encourage you to have a look at those. So one is, do I need a preventive control plan? Because there are some cases where you may not need one, smaller operations, etc. So this tool walks you through that. As I said, companies that already have previous CFIA HACCP programs are going to meet most of these new requirements. It may be just a matter of restructuring your food safety and quality plan. As I have emphasized throughout, these preventive controls require controls for non-food safety requirements such as weights and labeling. There is no special emphasis in extra record keeping for supply assurance, allergen programs, and sanitation. And I mention that because those of you who are familiar with FISMA Human Food Rule know that those three things, supply assurance, allergen, and sanitation, are really strongly emphasized, with record keeping almost equivalent to critical control points. That is not the same that's one big difference between SFCR and FISMA. Also, under there's no preventive control qualified individual required. There is a general provision about competency of the individuals running the programs, but it's not like in the US where you actually have to have a PCQI on site. Obviously, Canadian companies that are shipping to the US already have and need to have preventive control qualified individuals. So that's one difference to highlight for you. So preventive controls for domestic processors and exports. This is just what you need to do. I won't spend a lot of time on it. It's just the stepwise approach. Assemble your team. Make sure you have your basic GMPs or prerequisite programs in place. Do your hazard analysis, and then look at your measures for market fairness or other regulatory requirements. Make sure they're covered. There's that list there of labeling, grading, humane treatment of animals, post-mortem examinations, slaughterhouse. All those things are not food safety, but they're added on. Assemble your documents, and then there are templates that you can use that are available on the Safe Food for Canadians website. There are also people that can help. Your inspectors can help. Obviously we're consultants, we can help. So there's lots of places to get assistance with this. So just to highlight again for importers, the title of this slide is Preventive Control for Importers. To emphasize it again for importers who are maybe not used to this, they will have to have a written preventive control program. They can look at that tool to see if they need to have a preventive control. There's a self-assessment checklist there they can use as well, and there are also templates that importers can use. Again, for importers, same concept, the stepwise approach. Make sure you understand all the food you're importing. Make sure you have a complete list of every SKU, of every product detail, every label, a description of the product, much like HACCP, where it's going to be sold, etc. You have to know everything you can about your foreign supplier and their programs, whether GFSI certified, whether they're under a government inspection program in the country of origin, etc. And many meat and fish plants are, foreign suppliers are on exporter lists. So, for example, meat plants in the European Union can't ship to, unless you're on a list, you can't ship to Canada. Likewise, unless you're on an EU list, you can't ship from Canada to the EU unless you're on a list. So that's a very common thing globally. US used the same approach. So that's something you have to double check that's really largely in the meat and fish world, but some other food commodities as well. Again, for an importer, there are templates available, and I'll move to the next slide. Now, I'm just going to touch on this quickly. Brokers and distributors, in some cases, brokers do not need a license. But if a broker is an importer or an exporter or repackages and ships across provincial or international boundaries, then a license will be required for a broker or distributor. Brokers with no storage facilities or transport vehicles it's not really clear that these regulations apply. If a broker does take ownership of goods or imports them and then ships interprovincially, they may require a license at a preventive control program. So bottom line is at the bottom of the slide, if you're a broker or distributor, it can get complicated as to whether or not you need a license or not. Certainly we can answer questions for you on that. We'd have to take that offline if you have any questions of how the licensing might apply to you if you're a broker or distributor. So what to include in a preventive control plan? The standard stuff, your hazard analysis, your control measures, critical limits, etc. This is pretty well standard HACCP. Your procedures to verify, description of your measures to make sure you meet, again, the non-food safety elements that are regulatory, such as labeling and packaging. And you have to have your supporting documents you use to determine these hazards, your CCP rationale, etc. So traceability, again, another pillar. I've talked about it already. It's pretty straightforward. Now, here's a key point. All food businesses, including retailers, must have traceability. So processing companies, we've already covered that. They have to go one step back and one step forward out to distribution. Retailers in Canada now have to be able to trace products back to their supplier. And this is in the event of a recall. CFI found in the past that often retailers, there'd be a problem with a product that they're selling, and then they go to the retailer, and the retailer isn't even sure where they bought it from or what its origin is. So this is a new thing. Obviously, they'll only have to be able to trace back one to their supplier. I mean, for companies like Costco, they already have this, but for the mom and pop grocery store, this will be a new thing for sure. I should mention in this, excuse me for a second, restaurants are exempt from this requirement. And there is a CFIA tool that you can look at what your traceability requirements would be. Again, I think for most of you in the food business now, it's not complicated. It will be readily understandable, and you probably already have it. Should mention that transporters are exempt from this. In other words, trucking companies are not responsible for, under these regulations, for traceability. That is another set of regulations on conveyances of food that will come in the next year or so, I've been told by CFIA. So more to come on that front. You have just a quick piece. Your traceability, obviously, there have to be records that identify the food, where it's kept, how it's been shipped, etc. You have to keep the records for 2 years, and if CFIA requests those records, you must provide them. There's no option there other than face a fine. You have to have a recall and a complaints program. Also, it's very specific in the regulations. Food safety and regulatory issues have to be investigated immediately. This is exactly the same as FISMA. There's mandatory reporting to CFIA if any food safety risks arise. Complaints, also, you have to have a formal complaint program. All complaints have to be investigated and recorded. Recall procedures and all contacts need to be documented. Companies have to conduct mock recalls at least once a year. This is very much like GFSI current standards. Now it's the law in Canada. Records of details have to be kept for 2 years. And recall effectiveness checks have to be done and recorded. I should also mention that there is very clear in the regulations that if CFIA wants to see the records during a recall, they have to be made available quickly to CFIA. And they have to be they can't be just a shoebox full of paper, or it has to be well organized, and if it's in software, it has to be a readily accessible database or software that they can use it. So in the past, if I ran into a lot of troubles with that, now they've tightened that up very significantly, that access to company information and recalls. Okay, here's a quick overview of when companies have to comply. So as of last week, meat, fish, eggs, dairy, processed fruits and vegetables, honey, and maple. So the mainstream commodity, well-regulated sectors who are largely already well prepared already have to have this in place and have to have a license. Now, if you're an importer of, say, honey, you really didn't have to have a preventive controls program or a license before. So there are sectors here for which this is a new deal. So I don't want to suggest that it's no impact. I'm just saying that a large portion of that population should be reasonably well prepared. If they're not, they were already out of compliance. 1 year out, fresh fruits and vegetables come into effect in 2020, and then all other foods have 2 years. So that's the phase-in period. So bakeries and confections, you get another 2 years. So if you're an importer of baked goods to Canada, you don't have to have a license for 2 years if that's all you're doing. One key point here is if you're a Canadian manufacturer and you're baked goods and you think you have 2 years and you're exporting to the U.S., you don't have 2 years. You cannot export to the U.S. from Canada unless you have a license as of January 15th. And that's because Canada is providing a list of companies in good standing to the U.S., and the U.S. will use that list to prevent or entry of products that are not on that list. So key point for Canadian manufacturers or companies in the U.S. that own Canadian manufacturing that ship to the U.S. or elsewhere. Okay, sorry about this slide, got a little mixed up, but just a quick comparison of FISMA versus Safe Food for Canadians. I've tried to highlight that as we've gone through for your benefit. In the U.S., you have to register the Bioterrorism Act, etc. That doesn't change. Canadian companies still have to do that. However, in Canada now you have a much more comprehensive type of license that requires mandatory preventive control programs. The FISMA human food rule focuses mainly on food safety, whereas the Safe Food for Canadians is food safety plus other regulatory requirements. I've emphasized that throughout this presentation as the big difference. As I've said, this regulation covers all food. Obviously, FISMA doesn't cover meat, poultry, catfish, so there's a little difference there. No PCQI in Canada requirement unless you're shipping to the U.S. One big difference that I've noted is that in the U.S. there was a lot of financial support of PCQI training and et cetera from FDA and government. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in Canada for whatever reason. So there is a bit of scrambling to get information out, I would say, as compared to the rollout of FISMA. I don't want to be critical, but it's. I think there was opportunity. CFI did its very best, but and they've done a good website, but the rollout of training on Safe Food for Canadians has not been as comprehensive as it was in the U.S. So that may be why some of you are. This is new stuff and you haven't heard about it. And you're trying to get information that's kind of understandable. The foreign supplier verification program under FISMA, all CFI licensed processors will be recognized under for that program. So that's an important point. In the U.S., FDA has very limited cost recovery or fees, whereas in CFIA has charges for licenses and services such as exports. So those are the main differences between the two. There's far more similarities than there are differences, I must say. Okay, I'm going to have to go quickly and wrap this up. There is an equivalency agreement between Canada and the U.S., so it really means, to a great extent, unfettered trade in food between Canada and the U.S., which is a very good thing. Obviously, CFIA will investigate where they need to, as will USDA and FDA, so it's not a completely open border, but certainly trade in food between the two countries is very well regulated. It's based on agreements and recognition of inspection programs. For meat inspection, a lot of the rules, and if you're in the meat world, a lot of those rules will stay largely unchanged. So there's a few exceptions to that. You still have to have the registered bioterrorism number if you're in Canada. PCQI I mentioned. Oh, a key point here. U.S. companies can hold a Canadian import license. So if you're a manufacturer in the United States and you are exporting product to Canada or importing to Canada, you may hold a license. U.S. is the only country in the world where that is allowed. That was controversial, but that's the way it works, which is a great thing for both sides, really. Makes it a lot easier. Just some tips on implementing your plans. Try to maintain one plan as much as possible for FISMA, Safe Food for Canadians, and GFSI. I know that's hard to do, but try to have one food safety plan. If you're involved in all three of those, it can be a nightmare trying to keep different books, so to speak. Canadian companies are in good shape if they have existing programs, but they'll need to make sure that there's no gaps in terms of those regulatory programs. There's less emphasis on environmental monitoring programs, micro programs in these regulations than by FDA. So Canadian companies have to be aware that they need to, in some cases, be more vigilant on environmental monitoring programs. And again, Canadian companies need to consider FISMA, and that there's an emphasis on allergen, supply chain, and sanitation. And recognize that FDA will be coming to Canada to assess the system. So you may get, a Canadian company may get a visit from an FDA investigator. Likewise, CFIA inspectors will be doing audits of the FISMA follow-up. So you may very well see a Canadian inspector in a US plant as part of overall systems audits between the two countries. Okay, I'm quickly, yeah, I think we can skip this slide. Just to mention quickly, things aren't going to change overnight immediately. There will be some leniency in enforcement, as we saw with FDA in the first year or so. There will be a bit of difference. There's a big challenge within CFIA to train all inspectors on the new system. So I guess the bottom line on this slide, there's going to be some transition and adjustment for industry and for CFIA, and that's understandable. So those are kind of things to expect. CFIA will not lose its commodity expertise, but in general, inspectors will be more generalists than commodity experts. So that will change things a bit. That's very much like FDA. Now, just quickly, how you get your license and other services, go to the CFIA website and you'll see My CFIA. That's the secure online portal to apply for your license. Enrollment is free. It says here, easy to do. That's not really true. It is actually allow for at least an hour because it requires banking information and so on to get registered on CFIA. The actual license application is very easy. It only takes a few minutes, but you have to register first. So that's a very important piece of information, knowing where to go. And there's good videos on the CFIA website on how, and there's a helpline for that. So very important. Okay, sorry I ran on a bit too long, but as Brian said, there was a lot of information there, and I tried to get through it all. So I'll turn it back to you, Brian.
No, fantastic. First, take a breath. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was a bit of a risk.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. And you can see, I mean, there's just so much to cover with this, and you can see why it's so important. And I think you pointed out, you know, with the potential lack of training or just different rollout, that it's leaving a lot of people with a lot of questions. So with that in mind, I'm going to try and get to a few of these, Cameron, and you know, maybe we'll take it a few minutes over. If not, I'm going to touch on a couple of key questions that have come in. One is, yes, we are going to distribute a copy of the recording as well as a link to Cameron's deck. So we'll have that all out in short order, so you'll have access to that. And he was kind enough to put all this together. We'll make sure any of the formatting issues are handled. That might have just been the GoToWebinar piece. So we'll make sure you have everything clean and clear on the deck itself. And those will be coming out shortly here. So I'm going to try and go through. I mean, we have a ton of questions. The other thing that we're going to do is Cameron will take what we don't get to here offline, and there's two ways we'll do that. The primary way we'll do that is probably get answers to the questions, and we have a LinkedIn group for FISMA Fridays. So while you're kind of hanging out here for the Q&A, pop on over to LinkedIn, look for the FISMA Fridays group, and click to join that. And that's where we like to post all of that. And before anybody starts popping off here from the webinar, I just wanted to thank you, Cameron, for bringing this to light and putting this together for us exclusively. We really, really appreciate the time and effort that went into this. And I think this is a really great starting point for a lot of folks. So with all that said, I'm going to jump into a few of these. Cameron, I know some of these you may want to pass on because they're going to be a little specific, and some may require just advice that you're maybe not quite comfortable giving in a public setting. That would be better taken offline. So so the first one that comes in here is try and truncate this a little bit. It says, work for a U.S. firm, have a question about labeling net weight for product being sold and shipped to Canada. Does the KG statement have to come before the LB statement on the label?
The which statement? Sorry, Brian.
They're referencing the KG statement, come before the LB, so kilogram before the pound statement on the label. So I
It
guess,
should. Yeah, the metric it should be primarily in a metric declaration with a secondary imperial or U.S. Declaration. It doesn't have to. I don't think CFI is going to make you tear your label off
right.
over that.
Okay.
But yeah, but it's metric is the official system of measure in Canada, so they would like to see that first. Yeah.
Keep it that way. Okay. I think you covered this, but I think it's a good general question to answer, because I think we're going to see this a lot. In that, here's somebody said, we heard as long as we're FSMA compliant, we should be in good position to meet Canada regs. What are the most important things to consider, right? So I think you have some slides there that compare the two. Do you have any other advice for people who are FSMA compliant, maybe where to focus first, or just go back to your slide that compares the two?
Well, I think the big thing, and I said this repeatedly through the presentation, is that there are Canadian regulatory requirements that go beyond what FSMA requires, where FSMA is largely a food safety orientation. So
right.
you have to, and that question you just gave us, Brian, about declaration on labels. Well, yeah, that's a classic thing. It's different between Canada and the U.S. Metric, French and English, as opposed to Spanish and English. There are language and labeling things, tolerances on weights. The systems are slightly different. So they're more those non-food safety regulatory things. Some food additives are permitted in the U.S. are not permitted in Canada, and vice versa. So, the nutrition facts label is different and has changed again recently in Canada. So you have to do your research on all of those things. That's really no different from the way it was before, these new regulations, but it just means that your preventive control plan has to cover them now.
Right. Well said. And going through these, you did a great job. I think you touched on answers for a lot of the questions that were coming in early on. A lot came up about licensing. Someone had asked about what are the chances that a company will be audited. I think the way you stated is absolutely in that first 3-year period, if I heard that right. There's a question about, can you discuss more what is required for PC plans for fruit and vegetable packers? So I think you touched on kind of the different requirements. Is there anything else you'd add to that for fruit and vegetables? I think that was delayed. I think it was a year out, correct?
Yeah. So yeah, not a whole lot. I mean, the traceability requirements will need to be there, and that may, just thinking off the cuff here and thinking out loud, that maybe the traceability might be a factor that you'd have to look at, and they'll have to have a preventive control plan, and some of those. I'm familiar with some fruit and vegetable dealers that don't have a preventive control program, so they're going to have to build one in the next year. But if they're linked to a U.S. company that's going to have the produce safety rule, then yeah, they're in good shape.
Okay, very, very good. Question here is, you mentioned in talking about traceability, you mentioned that their question is how much time is a good time to compile the documents? So they said that you mentioned that it should be done rather quickly. Do you have any estimated timelines for that, for a recall record?
Yeah, I don't think CFI would want to see that go more than 48 hours, especially if there's a food safety issue. Okay.
All right. Let's see. I think, again, I'm trying to read through these quickly that you were figure out if you've covered some of these. Here's a question I don't know if we covered. Is environmental program required? Or anything around environmental controls?
Not to the same degree as maybe FDA emphasizes. However, ready-to-eat foods, there is a Health Canada policy on ready-to-eat foods, and it requires very similar. It does require environmental monitoring for ready-to-eat foods. On non-ready-to-eat foods, there really not any requirement, mandatory requirement. So, but I mean, obviously, if you're shipping to the U.S. or you're under GFSI, you're going to have an environmental monitoring program anyway.
Right, exactly. Okay, I'm going to take one last one here. When a firm that has full control of all products which are out of spec and have to be recalled, have do you have to inform the CFIA before recalling?
Well, if there's, it's the same as in the U.S. There's no, if it's under complete control, you don't need a recall. But if there's any possibility that product will go to customers or market or into commerce, then you must notify CFIA. So,
okay. And I think that was the question.
Complete control, it's not a recall. Yeah, it's just getting the product under control.
But if there is a recall, then they would absolutely need to be notified. I think that was the question.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Well, listen, and we still have questions coming in, and we appreciate everybody's engagement on this. Cameron, we may need a part 2 here by summertime, so we may pull you back in. But this was a really, really great intro. And again, thank you so much. There's a lot changing here, and you can see why the folks over at TAG are such a valuable resource. So, you know, he said it once and said it quietly, but I'll shout it from the rooftops that they're the best in the business, and certainly encourage you with the amount of questions that we're seeing here. These are the types of folks that you want on your side. So in addition to the website I referenced for the CFIA, definitely encourage you to go over to the achesongroup.com. They've got a lot of great resources, and certainly can connect with them. We'll include Cameron's contact info in the link with the slides and the recording. So if you have specific questions, you can reach out to Cameron and his team and set up a consultation. We will also look to post the Q&A on our LinkedIn group. And so check us out, connect to us on LinkedIn there. And of course, on the safety chain side, you can imagine trying to organize all of these regs, all of these changes that are going on, and that's part of what we do, is make your life a little easier so you can sleep at night knowing that you're complying with all these things, and make your job a heck of a lot easier. So if you're interested in finding out how we can help you with this process, certainly let us know, and I encourage you to touch base with the folks at TAG to learn the nuts and bolts of what needs to be done. We've got a full library, so you can go over to safetychain.com, go to our resources tab. In addition to this webinar, we'll have all of our Beyond Compliance series there that you can download and listen to or read. And then we also have all of our FISMA Fridays, which we also do with TAG, that full library up there as well. So lots more to come on this, but Cameron, thank you again so much. This was fantastic. We appreciate the partnership with TAG and all your expertise here today, and we'll look forward to maybe bringing you back again soon.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for listening.
All right, thank you everybody for making time, and we'll hope to see you next month. Take care.